Hello there, I'm just going to quickly talk you through this PowerPoint which goes with the video of Mr. Caseman and I discussing Kamikaze and Bayonet charge. So if you work your way through this PowerPoint, by the time you get to the third slide, you'll find the discussion that Mr. Caseman and I have, which hopefully will model to you the sorts of things that you might want to bring up when you're answering this question. So to compare the themes of conflict in Kamikaze and one other poem from the cluster. So we're going to be comparing the themes of conflict in Kamikaze and Bayonet charge. So the first thing I want you to do, you've got that first question there, what kinds of conflict are there in the poem? So when we're thinking about the word conflict, if you're thinking about it from the noun perspective, it could be a serious disagreement or an argument, or if you think about it as a verb, it can be like a clash. So just have a think about what kinds of conflict you can think of that there are in these two poems. What are the poets trying to say about anything to do with conflict? And when you hear our discussion, you might go back and add to your list. Okay, so do that. This slide is your first task. Now you're going to be answering this question. Compare the ways the poet presents conflict in Bayonet charge and one other poem from the power and conflict cluster. That is what an exam question will look like. But we've given you the other poem that you're going to compare. In the exam, you'll have the choice, but today you're going to be comparing Bayonet charge and Kamikaze. Once you get to this slide here, I want you to have a think about, it's up to you which one is poem 1 or poem 2, but I want you to have a think about what main themes or ideas are central to each poem. Now this grid should help you to structure a plan for your essay. So you've got the main themes or ideas. What is the central message behind the poem in relation to the question? In Kamikaze, poem 1, and Bayonet charge, poem 2. You might then want to make notes about the imagery that the writer uses that link to some points that you want to make about the themes. So what senses are invoked? How does that affect our understanding of power and conflict, or the theme of conflict in the poem? What do you know now about structure? Think about rhyme schemes, if there are any, the rhythm that's used, how many stanzas are there, how many line lengths are there, and how does that link to the idea of power and conflict? Think about the tone of the poem. Think about the emotions that we experience. What does the speaker in the poem feel? How do you know that they feel like that? Think about other things to do with language. So what other devices or techniques are used to show anything at all to do with the central message to do with conflict? And then finally, how do the poets present conflict in the poems? Are there deeper messages conveyed within the poem? Okay, so you've got, that is an essay plan really to help you to structure an answer. You could try filling this in yourself and then listening to the discussion, or you could listen to or watch the discussion and then fill it in afterwards. That's up to you. And here I've just modelled an example paragraph for you, just to show it's not the best paragraph in the world, but I wanted to make it accessible to everybody. I'm just going to read through it, and you can see that I've colour coded it because these are the sorts of things we'd like you to try and include in a comparative essay. So in Bayonet charge, Ted Hughes presents conflict as a destructive and dehumanising force. So when the question says, how does the writer present conflict in Kamikaze and Bayonet charge? You must start with a really clear point that answers that question. So in Bayonet charge, Ted Hughes presents conflict as a destructive and dehumanising force. The poem begins in media res, and we are thrown into the action along with whoever it is in the poem who is suddenly running. I've done two things there. I've identified a technique, because that's one thing you do need to do. You need to identify poetic techniques, and I've also embedded a quotation there. So I've dropped in an example from the text. And then I go on to explain the effect of that. This helps us to understand the confusion and panic that the soldier in the poem is experiencing. And this sensory bombardment continues in the first stanza with his raw seamed hot khaki. in reference to his uniform, which is burning his skin as he moves. So begin to build up, not just using one example, trying to use several examples to show what effect the writer is trying to build up as the first stanza goes on. Instead of learning anything about the character, we're only given information that characterizes him as a faceless soldier. So I've said in the point that Ted Hughes presents conflict as a destructive and dehumanizing force. That means that he's taking away the individual from this person. He's saying that war creates these kind of human machines. So in my explanation, I've tried to explain how he does that. Instead of learning anything about the character, we're only given information that characterizes him as a faceless soldier embroiled in battle. The imagery of him stumbling across a field of clods and being dazzled by rifle fire adds to the feeling that his only purpose in this instant is to survive and to kill. He becomes less human and more part of the conflict. So again, I've added more examples from the text, and I have explained how that builds up this idea of conflict being presented as something that's destructive and dehumanizing. So the next thing I need to do is, because this is a comparison essay, I also need to compare something from Kamikaze to kind of go with what I've said about Bayonet charge. So if you can see in red here, you've got a comparative word. So similarly, in Kamikaze, we see the dehumanizing effects that conflict can have. We're basically saying the same thing, aren't we? In Bayonet charge, Ted Hughes presents conflict as dehumanizing, and also this happens in Kamikaze as well. So we're saying it's this similar theme. We see the dehumanizing effects that conflict can have when we are introduced to a kamikaze pilot about to embark on his destructive mission. The imagery of a shaven head full of powerful incantations effectively conveys the extent to which soldiers such as these had to surrender their identity and individuality of thought in order to perform a violent act that was seen as an honourable mission. So we've explained again how this image of a shaven head full of powerful incantations, what it makes us think about, how it helps us to understand what's happened to this man who's become this person who's willing to take his own life for the honour of his country. The incantations allude to brainwashing and a lack of independent thought. Now, I've left it there. I could continue with that particular paragraph. So what you need to do is use this as a model. That's kind of how we want to see your paragraph structured. And you need to make sure that you have watched the discussion between Mr. Caseman and I, and you have used this screen here, this chart, to plan what you're going to say in your essay. Okay, so try and structure it in this way. Start off by doing one paragraph, and then you pick something else to talk about, again, which hopefully you'll have picked up from the discussions between Mr. Caseman and I.